Today we have with us again S. Douglas Woodward for part 2 of his interview. Again, he is author of the new book, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Exposing the Lie of the Ancient Aliens. Doug, how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, last week we had we had such an awesome conversation. It was a great interview, and it's funny because reading through your book, we just barely scratched the surface.
Oh, that's really true, and we spent almost an hour and a half last week, and we'll probably
Yep.
spend the same time today. And yeah, we'll cover a lot of ground, I think, but still, there's just no way you can get into the depth that you get into when you write a book. So, folks that are interested will have to pick up a copy.
That's right, absolutely, and I would definitely recommend it. I spent this past weekend reading the last few chapters of your book, and I was blown away.
Uh,
I think what you said is true. A lot of the meat is in the the last few chapters, but really the whole book is vital information from a Christian standpoint, at least in my opinion.
That's right. Yeah, I definitely in the first basically 60% of the book provide a lot of the history of Mars, the players, sort of the religious background, the scientific background, and then as we move into from chapters 11 through 16, we really get into some of the most recent speculations about Mars, and the stories get even wilder and more intense, but probably more true to what I'd say kind of what the paranormal, the folks that believe in the paranormal, kind of what they are ascribing to Mars and what its meaning is to them. So it's certainly still very relevant.
Yeah, absolutely, and I've noticed that a lot too. And I think where we left off, and that's a great jumping off point for where we left off last week, because we were just starting to talk about Nikola Tesla and Marconi, and
Yes.
so I think that's a great place to pick up with what you just said. So, I've always found Nikola Tesla to be an extremely interesting individual,
Right.
and along with Marconi, he believed he was receiving messages from Mars. So can you
Yes.
tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, I guess the movie The Prestige, if your listeners have seen that with Christian Bale and who's the guy that plays Wolverine? Hugh Jackman.
Hugh Jackman. Yep.
Yeah, that movie was a fascinating movie, and
Yeah.
Tesla plays a pivotal role in that. Of course, it's all fictional, but still, Tesla is the true character that is in the film, and we know that Tesla lived at that time in Colorado Springs. This is just before the turn of the last century, around 1895 to 1901, in that time frame. Tesla lived in Colorado, and he was developing his concept of wireless electricity. And they even have that scene in the movie where he has all these light bulbs scattered out on the lawn, and he's illuminating them with a wireless electrical circuit. And so he's doing something very odd, very strange, and you see the Tesla coil inside his laboratory, and these giant lightning bolts and filaments, going off. So, but anyway, Tesla says in an article that he wrote that was published in Collier's Weekly in like 1901 that he was alone in his laboratory, and he began to get very frightened because he was using his radio, his new wireless radio, and he was sensing all of the thunderstorms and how far they might be away. They might be 1,000 miles away, but he could sense where those thunderstorms were with his device. And eventually, though, he began to hear some background noise, and so he was able to sort of block out all the other signals except this background noise. And he began to detect a pattern to it. Supposedly, he began to communicate with it and began to get sort of meaningful signals back, that he interpreted them as meaningful at least, and he began to be convinced that he was communicating with someone on Mars, probably in the underground, because even
Wow.
at that time they suspected that Mars was such an arid planet that anyone that was alive on Mars, and they believed that people were alive on Mars, literally people, that they must be underground. And so Tesla talked about this, that it was a significant, he thought it would be a tremendous discovery, a very climactic moment for humankind. And so he talked about it. Marconi had a similar experience, and so he also was public about his interactions. Again, at that time, people were so tuned into spiritualism, into channeling, into mediumship. That had been such a big thing. We know, kind of coming out of the Civil War, literally the thing that spawned this were the thousands and thousands of parents that had lost children in fighting in the Civil War, and then there were so many babies that were dying due to different diseases and coming through childbirth and whatnot, that there were so many grieving parents that the idea of a medium, someone that could help you contact your dead relative, was a really big deal. America was just chock full of mediums. The number of books written by mediums, channelers, and so forth was just tremendous. And so this was the environment. And so the idea that someone could wirelessly communicate, we hear both from Tesla, from Marconi, and from other authors that it's fascinating that they're using the radio as a means to communicate with the Martians. Gee, wouldn't it be good if we could communicate telepathically with the Martians? And so it kind of in that idea is contained the notion of remote viewing and the possibility of using telepathy and the sixth sense, if you will, as a means of communicating with these human figures that everyone believed existed on Mars. And so you had really just a tremendous amount of interest in this. You had people believing that there were human beings on Mars. Mars became associated with utopianism, the Marxism, and I jokingly say in my book that perhaps I should have written a chapter on Mars and Marxism, because there were so many authors at the time that were using Mars as an object lesson to extol the virtues of Marxism. That the Martians were more advanced than we. They had progressed from an evolutionary standpoint much further than we. They knew not to fight wars. It even got so ridiculous that certain authors would write object lessons for children and say that children of good repute would certainly follow the Martians' example and part their hair on the side rather than down the middle. So
Wow.
that's how common it was. Everyone believed that Mars was inhabited and that people were living on Mars. And if you grasp that, you understand that when Orson Welles did the War of the Worlds radio broadcast in 1938, he was talking to a world. That time, of course, he was broadcasting predominantly on the East Coast, but he was communicating to a world that believed in Martians.
Mm-hmm.
And so now another interesting story about the wireless communications with the Martians has to do with in 1921, 1922, in that time frame, that the U.S. Navy participated in a call, by Marconi, by Tesla, to provide radio silence in the world, and they would try to, in fact, map the radio signals that we were getting from Mars, and from that they would be able to detect what it was, perhaps, that the Martians were trying to communicate. They, in fact, had a person that became a key code breaker in the OSS, the forerunner to the CIA. And he was standing by, and they developed a specific machine that could actually map the radio signals and turn them into sort of graphic plots, and they could plot the communication. And so they created this machine, and they used it, and there was worldwide a agreement that the radio would not be used for a certain period of time every day, and then they would try to, during that period of time, they would try to communicate with the Martians. So they did this. And what they got back in terms of the communication was pretty eerie, because what was plotted on the graph was a profile of a strange-looking human face.
Oh, wow.
And so it sort of sent chills up their spines, and they weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. I forget who it was that I was reading that was talking about this, but he said that he looked like the face looked a great deal like Voldemort in the Harry Potter series. If you recall, Ralph Fiennes, who plays that character, he has sort of the nose is sort of pushed down, and it's sort of like indistinguishable from just his face. So it looked like an alien, and yet it was looked like a humanoid at the same time. So the story of Tesla and Marconi is yet another chapter in the whole issue of how humankind felt they could communicate with the Martians.
Wow, that's amazing. Did anybody try to do anything else since then with those signals, or try to debunk them, or anything else?
Yeah, there's later stories that talk about a guy named Hadanowak, I think his name was, who was trying to prove and get more detail as to what Tesla was doing, and he did his work I think in the 70s and 80s, and published some material. He was also working on this notion that Tesla had actually developed a gravitic radio machine rather than a sort of analog sound wave type machine that were traditional radio waves, light waves, travel in real waves with an up and down motion that we're familiar with, kind of like a jump rope, in terms of being able to move the jump rope up and down and watch a wave be propagated through the rope. That's the way waves work. Now, except that Tesla was trying to work on a different wave. He was trying to work on a pulsing wave that they called gravitic, but it was more like the analogy that actually Joseph P. Farrell uses, which I talk about in my book, is that instead of two partners holding a jump ropes and doing sort of waves back and forth, it would be more like each partner holding the end of a yardstick and pushing back and forth on that yardstick. There would be no wastage of energy. It would all directly connect to your partner, and you would be able to communicate very directly without any loss of signal, you might say, in terms of pushing them. You might knock them over if you're not careful. And so supposedly this was the kind of radio wave that Tesla was working on, and it becomes a portion of the other part of the story that we'll get to perhaps later when we talk about the cosmic war, ion cannons, and things like that.
Oh, but, yes, I have some questions.
yeah. So anyway, the answer is yes. And this guy Hadanowak, if that's the way to pronounce his name, had done quite a bit of work in this area, and he too felt that he was getting very specific signals that were emanating from Mars, and so that's all discussed in the book in more detail.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, that's fascinating, and it makes you wonder too what's at the real root of that.
Well, exactly. I probably every 30 minutes here we should stop and say, now, I don't really believe in little men and Martians.
Yeah,
I believe there are deceptive spirits that are playing on these sort of wavelengths, you might say, no pun intended, and they're attempting to foist a falsehood. And so that's how I interpret these things.
Yeah,
they're very, very sinister, though, no question.
I would have to agree, and we know from Scripture that Satan's the prince of the power of the air, so that could be a manifestation of that,
Yes.
airwaves and all that.
Yes, the ether.
Yeah, absolutely. Something you've written and talked about before in some of your other books are the Nazis and Freemasons, and
Right.
they seem to have made an appearance in this book as well. What's their role in all of this?
Oh, wow. Well, are you referring to Werner von Braun and his connection with Disney?
Yes.
There's a lot of Mars material there. Werner von Braun was the famous rocket scientist. He was an SS. The Schoffelschutz. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce the SS, what it's from. But nevertheless, von Braun was very interested in Mars and in the moon, and he always contended that his interest was not to fire missiles at London, but his interest was creating rockets that could take humankind to the moon and to Mars. And so, of course, eventually, von Braun came across and actually got his 100-plus member contingent of rocket scientists from Peenemünde, which was the German rocket design and manufacturing plant in near the I guess the Baltic Sea in Germany. Eventually had to be moved because the Allies could eventually reach it, and they had to move it further inland near Czechoslovakia. But anyway, von Braun was fascinated by Mars, and he developed a book called The Mars Project, and we talk a little bit about that in the book. Eventually, in the 1950s, he connected with Walt Disney, and Disney used von Braun as a consultant to create a series of TV films that were made for the Disney television program. Disneyland was what it was originally called. Eventually, it became the Wonderful World of Disney. That was, I think, I make the remark in the book, that was, I think, one of the first color TV programs that was broadcast in color was Disney's Wonderful World of Color. And so anyway, at that time, von Braun and Disney were pretty good friends. Even Willy Ley, who was another German rocket scientist that had actually snuck out of Germany through London into America in 1935, he too was a consultant in these programs. But 3 films were made, and these films also became sort of the genesis for a particular feature or entertainment. What would you call it? I guess a deal that you go to in the Tomorrowland at Disney. It was called Mission to Mars. Yeah, it was an amusement, you might say, a ride more or less that you would go to it at Disneyland initially, and they also had a feature in the Disney World, not Epcot, the Disney World out in the Magic Kingdom. That's what it's called in Florida, the Magic Kingdom, and so the work that von Braun at Disney did back in the 1950s was also featured in this amusement, and but I guess the question is, well, why was von Braun interested in space travel? And I do attempt to answer that in one of the other books, in PowerQuest Book 2. It seemed that the German SS and the Nazis were very keen to disprove the Bible. And they believed, in fact, there's a quote from Hitler's Table Talk that Hitler basically waxes lyrical and says that once we're able to, escape the bonds of Earth, we'll be able to travel, we'll be able to demonstrate that there are intelligences on other worlds, that other stars are just like our sun, that that mankind is but one of many intelligences in the universe, and that we will have disproven that Jewish faith, both the Jews and the Christians. Hitler was no fan of Jesus Christ either, and so there seems to have been a Nazi sort of mysticism that was driving von Braun to want to get to the moon, to discover on the moon or on Mars artifacts of ancient civilizations, and that this would help disprove the Bible. And that seems to be part of the mission. That was the mission to Mars from von Braun's perspective.
Wow.
So it's really interesting. Even in one of the films that he did back in the 1950s, it was shown on television around 1959, if I'm not mistaken. And in the film, I watched the film later, probably in the early 60s, because it was a film that we would watch in class. Mm-hmm. We'd watch one of these Disney films. But it's interesting because as they're traveling on the backside of the moon, the astronaut in the film is reporting that he's discovered an alien base on the backside of the moon. Huh. Well, that it was, sort of just fictionally, you hear the astronaut talking to mission control on Earth and how he's discovered there's apparently an alien installation here on the backside of the moon. So the idea that there were aliens on the moon, sort of like Transformers Dark of the Moon, that was a movie out a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. These are kind of myths that have been around for a while, and there's a lot of people that find they want to believe in these things.
Yeah, absolutely. What I think is so interesting is how a lot of the attempted discoveries of things like that is to disprove the Bible, and really it's trying, from my, at least from my perspective, in my opinion, it's an attempt to escape accountability from a higher power. And
Right.
it's really it's kind of funny that because what we talked about before with David Flynn's work, even if they did find some type of artifact or some maybe even an alien creature, it wouldn't necessarily disprove the Bible or
Right.
God.
Right.
And in part one, we talked a little bit about David Flynn and his research
Yes.
into Mars, and then connecting with that beyond what we already discussed. What's your overall impression of his conclusions, and how did they contribute to your book in the later
Yeah.
chapters?
Well, maybe it's best to take a step back and say, well, why did I write this book anyway? And part of it is to give Christians, those that read the book and listen to the interviews, to give them a way to reconcile the possible, I think probable, discovery that there is or are artifacts on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be true, but I suspect that it is true based upon all of the evidence that I've looked at so far. And if it is true, then Hitler's goal was to destroy the Bible, basically. But I think David Flynn points the way, as does C.S. Lewis. We might come back and talk about him in a second. But David Flynn sort of points the way to say, buried within the mystery religions of the ancient Greeks, and before those, they were known as the Arcadians or the Palastians, that there are these very ancient mysteries that suggest that humankind was visited by angels, by gods, and that these gods taught humankind metallurgy, cosmetics, how to make war, how to make weapons of war. And of course, this mirrors the account in the Book of Enoch that probably most of your listeners are familiar with, of the stories of the fallen angels and their offspring, the Nephilim, which means fallen ones, and the Raphaim, which is another word derived from that, which means giants. And so there's no question that there's this notion that that Flynn was trying to reconcile the issue of could there be. In fact, he is very specific. He believes that there are artifacts. He believes that the pyramids on Mars that Richard C. Hoagland and Mike Barrow talk about, they are pyramids. The 5-sided D&M pyramid, the 4-sided Elysium pyramid. There's a 3-sided pyramid. There are lots of very strange structures that defy the ability of nature to create these monuments, what Hoagland called the monuments of Mars. And so Flynn speculates that Mars, and I think we talked about this a bit last time, that Mars may have been and probably was a moon of another planet that has been exploded. It's known as the exploded planet hypothesis. The hypothesis is a couple of hundred years old, but it's been sort of revitalized by the late Tom Van Flandern, who was the astronomer at the Naval Observatory and wrote about this quite a bit, spoke about it. But Flynn sort of goes along with that, as does another writer we'll talk about, Joseph P. Farrell. And Flynn suggests there are a couple of passages in the Bible, in Jeremiah and Isaiah, in the Psalms, that refer to Rahab. And Rahab being the enemy of God, that God destroyed it, was able to break it into pieces. And it suggests that perhaps it was this planet where it was the location where the angels that departed from Jehovah, that Lucifer led a rebellion, and perhaps it was this place where they took up shop, you might say, and so he proposes that Rahab was the place, and that it was eventually judged and destroyed by Jehovah, and that is what has formed the asteroid belt.
Oh, wow.
And so there's, of course, a lot of discussion around the timing of that. And both Flynn as well as Joseph P. Farrell talk about the timing being anywhere from 12 to 13,000 years ago. as recent as that, to as far away as 3.2 million years ago. Mike Barra, the former co-author of Richard C. Hoagland, speculates about 1.3 million years ago.
Wow.
So there's these ideas that it happened long, long ago, and part of the story was when God judged this planet, it was obliterated. It was a planet with a tremendous amount of water. The water and the debris hit Mars, created a catastrophe on Mars, and Mars has these markings that tend to suggest that that's exactly what happened, because half of the planet is covered, probably was covered with ice until the ice eventually completely sublimated and turned into a gas and disappeared. But half of the planet is covered in craters, the other half far, far less so. And so it seems like Mars experienced some type of great catastrophe. And then the question, of course, is, well, how long ago did that happen? Well, anyway, the long and the short of it is that Flynn is saying this is how you reconcile the possibility that there could be monuments on Mars. These monuments may have been built by angels, by fallen angels, and they may, in fact, even such as the face on Mars, may even be a monument that shows the face of Lucifer.
Wow.
And of course, there's the idea. Hoagland talks about this. Flynn talks about this. That half of the face looks like a lion, and half of it looks like a human, and so that does smack of the cherubim, and of course, Lucifer was supposed to be a cherubim. So there's a lot there, but that's the essence of the story.
Wow. Yeah, that's fascinating, and I do. I know in part one I said that I don't really buy into the Gap Theory, but
Right.
what I do believe, though, what I will say is I do believe that and I believe that there's strong biblical evidence for it too, that there were, I guess you could call them civilizations, but there were angelic beings before the creation of Adam, and actually even before the Earth, because of what we read in books like in Job, and yeah. So when we talk about 10,000 years, or when I guess your version of the Gap Theory, do you see it as purely angelic before Adam, or do you see a possibility that there could have been a type of human race before Adam?
Yeah, I was sort of rereading David Flynn the other night, and he pointed out that that there's the views that have been expressed throughout the ages, even going back all the way to the Zohar, that there was a race, at least once, a race of human beings that existed before Adam, and that race, along with the angelic cohabitors of Earth, were destroyed in a great flood. So in this version, there's not one flood, but two floods. There's the flood of Noah, which may have only been 4,500 years ago, but there may have been also a completely destructive flood from about 12 to 13,000 years ago. And Flynn goes in and talks about it related to the precession. As we all look at the Milky Way right now, we see, if you're able to go out and see the Milky Way in the night sky, there's not enough fog, or smog or whatever. You can actually see the stars. The Milky Way kind of presents itself as an angle, but precession basically says that there is a time where you could look at the Milky Way and it would seem parallel to the horizon. It would be, in effect, you would be sort of encircled by the Milky Way. Well, the traditions of sort of ancient mythology is that the Milky Way does appear to encircle the Earth, obviously brightest on one side as we're facing towards the center of the galaxy. But the surrounding parts is really what is known as the Ouroboros, or the Leviathan, and the Hebrew. I guess the name for the Hebrew version of the Milky Way is the Leviathan, and it's the idea of the snake that eats its tail. And so that is the more commonly known today as the Ouroboros. But it was also in Greek. It was considered Poseidon. Poseidon was this god of the great sea that the earth was in, and the earth, in fact, the whole notion of mound builders, the pyramids, and all that, they seem to be a ancient reference to the earth emerging out of the sea. In the creation account, God talks about, Moses talks about how the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and that Yahweh eventually separates the waters above from the waters below. And the gap theorists believe that, in effect, the earth had been inundated with water, had been completely destroyed, and that God had to recreate the world by separating and bringing about dry land again, and pushing apparently a large portion of this water that had inundated the earth to push it away and to separate the waters above from the waters below. And so, in effect, he may have created what later becomes known as the water canopy, that would eventually break down and become the second flood, the flood of Noah. So anyway, in this notion, the earth appears as a big mound, and it's all in one location. It's Pangea, as we are taught about how the continents at one time were all together. The creationist view is that there was, yes, at one time a Pangea, a single continent, but during the time of the flood, the continent was separated and broke apart and moved rapidly rather than very, very slowly around the world. There was massive crustal displacement that occurred very rapidly. The gap theory might account for the fact that it may have been, millions of years ago when this event occurred, and that the separation or the spreading of the continents may have been much more slow. So there's sort of two different active theories that Bible-believing Christians have, one being sort of just intelligent design with an old earth, one being a young earth, following this sort of paradigm known as the creationist paradigm. So in either way, the idea of precession, that the earth wobbles on its axis, and what that does is it changes the pole star. The North Star is not, Polaris is not always the pole star. It has been Virgo at times. It's been other stars at times. Regulus, I think, at one time. But every 6,000 years, the Earth it appears that the Milky Way levels out in this parallel to the horizon. And it's at that time where supposedly new eons are introduced. This gets into the issue of the Sphinx. And what was the Sphinx looking at, and why was he faced the way that he was? And the astronomy and the astrology says that the sun, when the Earth is at that point where it is parallel with the Milky Way, the sun appears to arise out of the mouth of the Ouroboros, or out of the mouth of Leviathan. And it is that point that is the beginning of the new age, or a new aeon. 2 aeons ago, that was this sort of 13,000-year period, and it's that point in time that Flynn believes was the punishment by Jehovah against Lucifer that may have destroyed Rahab, may have destroyed humankind such as it existed before Adam and Eve upon the earth. And if you're interested, we can talk even more about the fact that this event seems to have been recorded around the world by a more primitive humankind, such as in the cave paintings, and in perhaps a universal hieroglyphic language that existed before this period as well. I talk about that in the book.
Yeah, definitely. It's stuff like that always leaves me open to the possibility, and because with so many things the past few years, I always have to wonder, okay, if I believe this way, is it because the Bible says so, or because the way I was brought up says so?
Yeah.
And there's always that kind of internal struggle with it, and that's what I love about talking with people like yourself and doing a show like this, because I get to and also expose my listeners to
Right.
ideas that are not always traditional, but might be more biblical.
Right, right.
And I love that. And at the very least, I mean, I'm open to the possibility, and especially with reading your book and then looking at David Flynn's work too. There's a lot there that says that it very well could be, and it might help explain a lot of the more difficult to explain away things
Right.
that
Right.
without a type of gap theory.
Well, that's
And
right. It gives a frame of reference that is different than the creationist framework, which is a young Earth. I believe that one can be a biblical, a Bible believing Christian, and be either a creationist or not a creationist, be a believer that believes in what we're calling the gap theory. And of course, the real proponents of the gap theory say, well, the gap, using the term gap, is a pejorative. It's a negative, and that it's not a gap theory. It's the reality. It's the gap reality. Well, of course, the creationists say the same thing. It's the creationist reality, evolutionary. Evolution's the theory. So anyway, so yes, that's exactly right. There are so many things that challenge the notion of a young Earth, and the possibility that you can go back and you can see these different aeons that happen every 6,420 years or whatever it is. That there's these new things that seem to be happening, and yet there are mysteries that we can't really understand. Why is it that some of these cave paintings appear to be 18,000 years old?
yeah,
Why how do we fit that into our viewpoint? Of course, the creationists will come up with a way to rationalize that.
yeah,
So, but nevertheless, the theory that I talk about, the idea that Mars might have existed as a civilization, that Rahab might have existed, and that Rahab was destroyed. This kind of gets into the issue of the cosmic war that Joseph P. Farrell in his books talks about. I don't know if you want to talk about that next or go a different direction, but we can talk about that.
yeah. Let's see. I know I have questions about that.
Yes.
I think the first thing that I have here was let's see. Oh, yep, that is. I usually don't divulge my list on.
No, that's okay. That's
But
okay.
yeah, I definitely do want to get to that. But before we get
No, no,
too
go ahead.
far,
We'll
but
lay it out.
yeah, but yeah, going back,
We're teasing
just
a future subject.
yes, we are. But yeah, going back to just to wrap up the whole viewpoint of the gap theory thing. I I think that's why I said at first in part one that I'm still on the fence, and yeah, some people have become irritated with me because there are
Yeah.
a lot of things I'm on the fence about, and I don't take a strong, solid stance on much beyond, like salvation, the real doctrinal
Right.
stuff that,
Right.
because a lot of that stuff, like you said, it in essence, it's not a salvation issue. You can
Right.
be saved and
Right.
believe in gap or believe in, the young earth thing,
Right.
and a lot of it's open to interpretation. There's a lot of possibilities, and I mean, for all we
Right.
know, it might be something else. We might get to heaven, and God might say everybody was wrong, and it's really
Well,
this third
no,
option.
I suspect that he will say there's a few things I've not shared with you yet that I'd like to disclose to you. By the way, it will take most of eternity to do that.
Hey, I got time.
So, yeah, that's right. We got nothing but time, or we don't have any time at all. We have only eternity.
Yep.
Um, but yes, I think that the important point is that the person like me believes, although the Earth may be billions of years old,
Hmm.
and there may have been a gradualism associated with the development of humankind, I think there was a point in time where Adam was specifically, directly created by God, as I may have said last time, that we took a hunk of clay and God, transformed that clay into Adam, and just as the biblical account tells us, that Eve came from Adam, and so forth. So one can be a believer in a old Earth, but you still believe that there is a distinct, direct creation
Hmm.
of the current version of Homo sapiens that has the ability to communicate with God, that has a spirit that once it's renewed through the power of Christ, is able to communicate rightfully, properly with Jehovah. So that is what I believe. So
Yep. And
that's
I
important.
believe that too.
Yeah, and I believe that is very important.
Yes, definitely. I couldn't agree more. And that's awesome. That's what I love about these types of conversations, and it allows for new possibility and also evidence for someone like
Hmm.
myself to get a different perspective of it, and
Right.
it's awesome. I love it.
Well,
No,
we'll have to have a discussion with Doug
yeah.
Camp sometime. We'll do a show with Doug, and Doug is he is a great scholar.
Oh yeah.
He can wrap me around the axle quickly because he knows Hebrew and I don't.
Yep.
So he can definitely go to his Hebrew to try to prove the creation account. So if we debate sometime and do it in a Christian loving way, we'll have to make sure that he understands that he can't win his arguments, cinch his arguments with Hebrew.
If you guys ever decide to do that, get a hold of me. You can do it on my
Absolutely,
show. I'll mediate.
it would be fun. It would be
Yep. Because I'm on the fence. I can see both sides, so I'm perfectly unbiased.
okay. Fair enough.
So before we get too far off track, getting back to
Yes,
your
yes,
book,
yes. Right.
we in part one we had talked a little bit about NASA's involvement in deception and stuff like that. Can you
Right.
tell us a little bit more about that, such as the claims of whitewashing photos, changing
Well,
monitor screens to make the Martian sky appear red instead of blue, and later
oh yeah.
releases of the face on Mars?
Well, certainly there's a chapter in the book that you're referring to called "The Photo Fights of Mars,"
Hmm.
and Hoagland and Barra are the two guys that really they've really championed the view that NASA knows a lot more than it's telling us, and that NASA is intentionally keeping proof away from us that there has been and there is a civilization. There are relics, there are artifacts of a civilization on Mars, and probably as well on the moon. I mean, they even believe that there were glass domes on the moon. These glass domes eventually were shattered. That the astronauts saw these. That the astronauts were hypnotized when they were walking after they got back after having walked on the moon to make them forget about what they saw on the moon. They have some very elaborate hypotheses. It's called in logic the multiplication of hypotheses. And of course, Occam's razor is the opposite approach. The simplest answer is the best answer, basically, is what it teaches.
Uh-huh.
But nevertheless, the recent book, Ancient Aliens on Mars by Mike Barra, I spend a considerable amount of time because it is the primary source of facts, quote unquote, that suggests that there may have been at some time life on Mars. We can come back later and talk about some of the supernatural, paranormal evidences for life on Mars.
Hmm.
But the issue of the photos is a direct empirical study that should demonstrate, yes, the face on Mars is real, or no, it's not, or yes, we are seeing clearly cube objects. We're seeing mechanical objects that have been destroyed, and they may look like debris, but if you look carefully enough, you can see that these, in fact, are really some type of artifact of a machine or something. So certainly the evidence is mounting that there is examples of this type of debris on Mars.
Hmm.
And it could be explained away. I don't think it's provable yet, one way or the other. But I would just say that that if you look long enough at the Elysium Pyramid, the four-sided pyramid that even Carl Sagan talks about in Cosmos, his 1980 book Cosmos, you look at that and you go, how in the world could that be a purely natural object? It is virtually a perfect four-sided pyramid. The five-sided D&M pyramid itself it looks like it could not be a natural object. But then if you study, as Hoagland points out, the entire complex known as the city at Cydonia, you see all of these interesting angles that they draw, these angles from the D&M pyramid to the face, to the tholus, as it's known, this spiral object that mirrors the object Silbury Hill in England. If you look at these connections, you go, it looks like someone's trying to give us a geometry lesson on the surface of Mars. Well, and that's, of course, what Hoagland did, is that he and I believe it's Greg Molinar came up with a model that said they're showing us 19.5 degree angles. What is
Wow.
19.5 degree angles that we need to know? Well, Hoagland goes in Dark Mission and talks extensively about them and says, well, what it is it's a key to understanding a level of physics that goes beyond what Einstein was teaching us. And it actually relates to probably what Tesla was teaching, that Tesla was sort of the minority view and Einstein the majority view. But it's known as the alternate physics. And 19.5 degrees, it's technically 19.47 degrees. And we'll come back to that, because that immediately we think of Roswell when we think of 1947. But anyway, what it does is it makes a suggestion that there is some type of hyperdimensional truth that they were trying to convey. Well, there is an interesting factor, which Hoagland points out. If you look at Mars, the Olympus Mons, which is the largest volcano in the solar system, it's like about 75,000 feet high. So it breaks through the atmosphere of Mars, because the atmosphere there is very thin. We think of Mount Everest as just under 30,000 feet. Well, this Olympus Mons is about 75,000 feet tall, and it appears at 19.5 degrees above the equator on Mars. The Jupiter red spot is at 19.5 degrees below Jupiter's equator. The dark spot on Neptune is 19.5 degrees above the equator.
Wow.
The Hawaiian Islands, the big island of Hawaii, the volcano there is roughly 19.5 degrees above the equator.
Huh.
So there's this common observation that we've made on the planets, that the planets seem to be creating some type of a storm, some type of a crustal sort of problem at this point. And then what Hoagland talks about is the discovery that Jupiter, the great red spot on Jupiter, is actually generating energy rather than just absorbing the sun's energy. So Jupiter is actually giving off more energy than it's absorbing. So the question is, well, how in the world is it doing that? Well, and the answer appears to be this vortex that's created at 19.5 degrees. And so the theory now runs, and it seems to be true, it gets back to also the notions of platonic solids and the idea of a three-sided pyramid, and where it would intersect. If you did a perfect, it's really a four-sided because it has a bottom as well as the three sides. So if you did a three-sided pyramid and you placed it within a perfect sphere, it would touch that sphere. The points would touch that sphere at 19.5 degrees off of the center axis. So, and this scientific fact was actually predicted by, I think it was either Maxwell or one of the other scientists a couple hundred years ago, that the tetrahedral pyramid would give off or disclose sort of the clue to a deeper physics, to an understanding of potentially even the links with space-time. And so the theory is that the architects of the monuments of Mars were actually embedding in those monuments the truths of hyperdimensional physics, that it is at this point where one can have a sort of breakthrough physics, and one can understand how to, in effect, leach energy, pull energy out of the ether, basically out of what creates the universe. And of course, this gets into a whole another discussion about what is the ether, what is the material what is the substance with which all of the universe is created. And as I've said in one of the other books, the basic theory is that it should be no surprise to Christians that the actual lowest substance is not atoms, it's not quarks, it goes beneath all of that. Mm-hmm. It is time itself. Time is the creation material that is the out of which the earth is fashioned. So whether it's matter or energy, beneath all of that is substance, the ether known as time. And so it appears that at a certain angular, with a certain amount of angular momentum mixed in, which angular momentum is the rotation, it's the sort of the energy that's generated when a body is rotating. So these bigger bodies, the planets in effect, when they're rotating, something magical sort of happens at 19.5 degrees, and that is that the other dimensions beyond the dimensions that we know of, the four dimensions, the fourth one being time, that at that point space-time sort of buckles, and we're able to bridge into the other dimensions.
Oh, wow.
So that's really what the story is. And so the idea that it takes a long time to discover this, that the angelic beings may have been building monuments on Mars to preserve the fact that this is the key to understanding the way that Yahweh built the creation. Huh. And so it is very similar to the issue. Well, why would people do that? Well, the pyramid in Egypt, the Great Pyramid in Egypt, Giza, appears to be a monument constructed with all sorts of clues about the nature of the Earth, the nature of our solar year, and so on. And it gets into the concept of the sacred cubit. How long is each side of the pyramid? Well, it's something like 768 feet. But if you divide it by 25.2 feet, which is sort of 2 feet 1 inch, 2.1, it turns out to be 365.2422 days, or sacred cubits, which reflects, of course, the exact size or exact length of the solar year.
Wow!
And there are probably a dozen or more factors built into the pyramid. If you were to take the side of a pyramid and divide the height of the pyramid into twice the width of the side, you come up with an irrational number 3.1416. You come up with pi. So pi seems to be incorporated into the pyramid as well, indicating that the builders of the pyramid were architecting and were embedding scientific and mathematical truths into the pyramid as a way of keeping that knowledge from being lost to their successors. This gets into the idea of Sir Isaac Newton, that he had discovered the size of the sacred cubit, this 25.2. It was not really known until his time, and then even more recently in our time with Flanders Petrie and some of these other scientists that discovered the metronic yard, the megalithic yard is what it's called, megalithic yard versus the metric. Mm-hmm. And so there's all these keys to mathematics and higher knowledge that seem to be embedded in the pyramid at Giza and may be embedded in monuments on Mars. That's the argument of Hoagland and Barra, is that these special creations, special things that look so odd on the surface of Cydonia, in fact, are monuments that convey this information.
Wow. Yeah, that's so cool, and I especially appreciate it because it kind of falls in line with what my next book will be about. There's another tease for it.
Tell us about your next book.
Well, I'll say it has to do a lot with the dimension of time and really what reality is, and using the Bible as a framework for that, but it really goes into like the other dimensions. But well, we're not here to talk about my book.
That's okay.
So do you think with all this knowledge and these things that could potentially be learned, is it possible that may be why NASA will do things like possibly change photos? There have been stories about that, like right. the next release of the or I think it was like the second picture of the face on Mars in the 90s, that it it looked all weird and photoshopped.
Oh, yeah, the kitty litter.
Yeah.
Kitty litter photo. Yeah, there was a photo. I think it was in 1996, if I'm not mistaken, in that time frame, that the Mars Global Surveyor, or the predecessor to that spacecraft, took a picture after all kinds of political infights for years, until finally congressmen were able to get NASA to agree to pay attention to the Face on Mars brouhaha and to train its cameras on the higher resolution cameras on the face in hopes that it would give a better picture of what this face really was. It would prove convincingly once and for all that it really is a face or it's not a face at all. Well, when NASA finally agreed to do this, and so when the photograph came through, it was several hours before NASA released it. They released it, I think it was in the middle of the day, and you had the news services like Tom Brokaw, and you had Dan Rather. You had them all sort of poised and ready to report on this. Well, the image came out, and the face on Mars just looked flatter than a pancake, and everyone was just astounded. It was like, well, how we've seen pictures of the face, the most famous being the 1976 picture from Viking 1, but why does it look like it's been smashed down to where there's nothing there? And so on the news that night, I think Tom Brokaw said, "Yeah, it's just what we knew it was. It's just nothing at all." And Dan Rather said, "Yeah, it's just a pile of rocks." And so that night, Art Bell on Coast to Coast had Hoagland on, and they were lamenting about this. And Art says, it's just that's just no face at all, Richard. Of course, Richard had been the cheerleader since he had published the book The Monument of Mars in 1988, about 8 years before. And so Hoagland was just going, well, I know, it's just amazing. And they had so when they finally released this sort of the second picture that NASA released, it was even clearer that it was like flatter than a pancake. And so it was like they were trying to intentionally, it was like, well, are they trying to image process it in such a way that they destroy the facial features of it? Well, it turns out that they were, and that this is where the mystery and the plot thickens, because as Barra talks about in his most recent book, Ancient Aliens on Mars, they basically duplicated the sort of the use of Photoshop to show how NASA destroyed the image of the face.
Wow.
And and so then the question really becomes, well, why? It speaks volumes if NASA is in fact trying to hide the face. Why are they trying to hide the face? And is it because there really is a face and they don't want people to know about it? And if so, why not? And so this opens the question we talked a bit about last time. The Brookings Institute, their report back in 1960 that, as Jack Nicholson said in let's see, what was the name of that movie with Tom Cruise and Demi Moore, where he says, you can't handle the truth. The public can't handle the truth. It was something about Courage Under Fire. No, it wasn't that one. It's another one. But anyway, your listeners will go, it's this movie, Doug. It's this movie. But it's not important anyway. The issue is, can people really handle the truth? And if there really was a civilization on Mars that's demonstrable based upon photographic evidence, can we, how would we reconcile that? And so I'm probably being a little too nice, giving NASA the benefit of the doubt. I'm sort of saying, well, it may well be that NASA just doesn't want to admit it because it fears the ramifications that religionists will beat on NASA, and NASA will become public enemy number one because it's spoiled our beliefs about our religion. And I remember back in 2006, I listened to Mike Heiser, who is a biblical theologian and scholar, on the same program with Richard Hoagland, with Art Bell, and they were talking about this whole issue of what would happen if we discovered that these artifacts really were true and that there really was a civilization on Mars, and mankind is not alone. There are intelligence in the universe, and so there was a lot of debate and discussion. But Heiser was basically taking the position that Christians would be able to weather the storm, that we have found a way to reconcile things in the past, and we will find a way to reconcile this as well. And so Art Bell was actually sort of challenging that, because he said, all all the evangelicals and the fundamentalists that call me, they beat on me so thoroughly and unforgivingly that I can't believe that they would easily accept this. And so Heiser was actually agreeing with Hoagland and taking Hoagland's position more or less, which I found a little bit curious. But nevertheless, that was kind of where he was coming from. But anyway, I never explained the kitty litter comment. So what Art Bell had said back in 1996 was that, Richard, he said, basically what I'm seeing here is this looks like a face that the kitty could scratch up in his kitty litter box. And so it was known thereafter as the kitty litter photo of the face on Mars. But by 2001, the Mars Global Surveyor began to give us a picture that once again really reinforced the fact that the face on Mars was not flat. It seemed to be situated on a plateau. It seemed to have we saw perhaps even more detail of how one side looked to be lion-esque and one side looked to be human. And of course, that gave Hoagland and others a lot more to cheer about in terms of the belief that there really is a face on Mars and so on. So I still think you can't prove it. I think that the image of the face on Mars to some extent is in the eye of the beholder. I think a believer would look at that and say, "Can't you see the two eyes?" I mean, David Flynn did a really nice job of sort of tracing out the features of the face on Mars. One side looks like a lion, one side looks like a man. And he reinforced that his sense was that this was the face of Lucifer, as illustrated by the fallen angels who built it on Mars. And Wendy Alec, in her last book, A Pale Horse, she uses it as a plot line in her book. I may mention that last time, but it's her book called A Pale Horse, and that's exactly what she supposes. And so there's the broader issue, of course, is there a relationship between the Egyptian pyramids and the Martian pyramids? And of course, that's a theme that I take up in the book and talk about quite a bit as well. Back to you, Josh. I don't want to completely step all over your questions.
No, you're doing perfect. I just like part one. I'm on the edge of my seat through this whole thing. I'm loving it.
I hope that listeners are equally enthralled.
Oh, I'm sure they are. The few listeners that keep in contact with me and write me and we talk and everything, they seem pretty like-minded, so I'm sure they are.
Well, they probably are. Yeah, that's probably true.
So what about let's get into some stranger territory here, as if we haven't already.
Right.
What about things like deep underground bases, jump rooms, time travel, all those types of theories circulating out there? What are your thoughts, and do you think there's anything there? Do you think there's any validity?
Well, there's something there. Now, whether it's valid and it is what the proponents say it is of course another matter. But to give the listeners some background, there's one thread we need to talk about, which is the concept of deep underground military bases, or DUMBs. That's one thing we need to talk about. We need to talk about the issue of what is a wormhole, and we need to talk about what is this idea of a jump room. So these notions have been batted around on the internet now for 4 or 5 years. So it's not a brand new topic, but it still is a topic that most people know nothing about. And but in surveying the influence of the knowledge of Mars and what it might mean to humanity, this concept of the jump room has become sort of front and center, becomes the issue. So first, let's talk about deep underground military bases. This has been a conspiratorial theory for quite some time. It's becoming, what I attempt to do is just to say, it's really not that hard to imagine, because we now know that there are these very, very powerful machines that are bigger than a bus that are able to drill through hard rock, and they are doing so. They're being used. We see pictures of them now. They're being used to build new subways. They're used to create underground structures of various kinds. We know that for some time that the U.S. military has had underground facilities in Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. There are facilities other places that appear to be part of the program for the continuation of government in the event of a nuclear attack. And so the idea that the military may have created bases, deep underground military bases, is not as hard to believe now. It seems logical that they would, because just as you hear about with the various nuclear generation facilities in Iran, there's discussion about whether the bunker buster bombs could really go deep enough to reach these underground centrifuges that Iran supposedly has built to enrich uranium and to create a nuclear weapon. And so we know that this activity is going on, that building bases deep underground is a way of making them impervious to attack. And so it's likely that that's in fact what's happened. Now, jumping to Mars, pun intended, I suppose. On Mars, there are these sort of fictional accounts that have been, I argue, almost an archetype. The face on Mars. I don't know if we talked about the comic book last time. I think we probably did.
Yeah.
But it's one of those stories. The comic book story was from 1958. The Tom Corbett Space Cadet story was from 1953. In the same time frame, there are the stories from a guy named Ernest Norman, who was a channeler. I talk about the red docs that are out on the internet that go into great detail about various channeling experiences that mediums have had. And his experiences, Ernest Norman, was to go to Mars and to go into the underground cities of Mars. This was in the 1951 to 1956 time frame. And he would, in effect, soul travel or astral project himself to Mars, supposedly, and would be curried about by a Martian named L something. I forget the name now, but it was L something. Of course, L is the name of God in Sumer, and Elohim is one of the names of God in the Old Testament. Well, anyway, he goes into great detail. He's escorted by a Martian through all these underground cities on Mars, and is given all kinds of data points about Mars, many of which, of course, are incorrect. Things like, well, the Martian axis is set at 6 degrees, so there's really no seasons. That's not true. We know the Martian axis is almost the same as on Earth, and it has seasons. So there are many facts that the supposed all-wise and all-knowing Martian gave Ernest Norman that are not true. But nevertheless, the elaborate descriptions of these underground cities, this was something that was being floated around back in the 1950s. So lots of ideas about underground cities on Mars, underground bases on Mars. And lo and behold, we come into the last 4 or 5 years, and we're hearing these accounts by a gentleman named Andrew Basiago. Andrew is a patent attorney, if I remember correctly, out in Vancouver, Washington, which I used to drive through on my way to Portland. I lived in Seattle for about 21 years until about a year ago. So he works, excuse me, I'm going to take a little drink.
Go for it.
These long interviews, they get to my voice. Basiago works as an attorney in the state of Washington, but he has been touring over the last 4 or 5 years, talking about his experiences as a child, doing time travel when he was about 10 or 11 years old, and then later as a teenager when he was about 17 or 18 years old, actually being placed in an elevator, and within 15 minutes, at least that's the time that he gave, he would be transported to Mars. He would arrive just under the surface of Mars. He gives hints that it was near the face on Mars, but he would walk up to the surface and he would be able to walk about. And so he talks about Mars as a very habitable planet, apparently able to breathe. He didn't have to have a special breathing apparatus, but he tells the story that he was trained in order to be able to go to Mars. And but before I go there, let me go back and talk. Feel free to interrupt with questions. But he talked more about the ability to do time travel in programs that were developed in the 1960s by the military using Tesla science. So Tesla pops up again here. And supposedly he would be in New York or New Jersey, and he would be transported from a military base there out to a city in New Mexico. it wasn't Roswell, but it was not too far away from Roswell, and that he would be transported, teleported literally in a few moments from a machine in New Jersey to New Mexico. And also in this period of time, they could be transported back in time. And supposedly he tells stories, well, he does tell stories, not supposedly, of being traveled back to Gettysburg and to appearing in a photograph that's taken of a child that he claims is him as an 11-year-old in front of the rotunda, or the stand actually, where Lincoln in a few minutes was soon to step up and give the Gettysburg Address. And so that's one of his more extravagant stories, but not his only by any stretch. Nevertheless, his presentations, and people can watch them, they're very compelling. He seems extremely sincere, and I don't doubt his sincerity, actually. I think he believes these things all really occurred. And so he talks about these experiences of time traveling as a young lad. He talks about some of the misadventures of some of the other young lads. He talks about one time in which he was on this air base. I'm not sure if it was Wright Field in Ohio or if it was the military base he was at in New Jersey, where he meets the Martians, a humanoid race that looks very much like us, but not perfectly like us. And from his standpoint, it was sort of clear that there was sort of a different, a break in the evolutionary progress, that we look different from them. Probably could still mate with them, but nevertheless, they don't look exactly like we look today. So he talks about that rather matter-of-factly. So anyway, then you come up to about his 18th year, and he's now probably in his late 40s, I'm guessing, from seeing his pictures. But he was supposedly trained by Major Ed Daines, who was the trainer of all of the remote viewers. We've talked a bit about remote viewing already, and how it was used as a means to survey Mars, both above ground and underground, at least purportedly so by those that do the remote viewing. Ed Daines, Pat Price, Joe McMoneagle, Ingo Swann, and others. Lynn Buchanan's another name. Anyway, Bashago talks about that he was trained along with, sounds like, about 24 other teenagers, and Ed Daines said that their mission would be to go to Mars and to help acclimate the Martians to the human presence, because it was our plan to colonize Mars. So he talks about the fact that he traveled to Mars for brief periods of time, and he was escorted there by, or met there by, a CIA agent, because this was then a CIA program. And he would go to Mars, and he would walk around Mars, and then he would also go underground and see the underground base on Mars. Now, he talks about this. There's another gentleman named Michael Relfi, who talks about his experiences. He claims that he was transported to Mars and lived on Mars for 20 years, serving as as a serviceman in the military, serving on Mars, and that eventually, though, he would be transported back to Earth. His memories would be wiped, and he would be transported back and go back in time to when he first departed, so that the 20 years he spent on Mars, bringing him up to about 1996, he would be transported back to 1976. And so he actually had 20 years of experiences serving on Mars that were supposedly wiped clean by a type of mind control program instituted by and used on him by the CIA. So his stories are also out on the internet, and I've read them. His wife, Stephanie, essentially what she did was she used a sort of technique to help him recover his memories, break through the programming, the mind control programming that had been practiced on him to help him forget his memories of Mars, and that he was then able to recall. And he was able to give pretty much the standard spiel about reptilians, gray aliens, and he said a number of things in the course of his book that are pretty pretty inconsistent in terms of how the reptilians and the Nordics, the very tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed aliens, how they were actually related, and they're kind of like, wait a second, the 3-foot tall aliens and the 7-foot tall Nordics are related. That doesn't seem to make too much sense. So there's some things to pick apart in this story.
Wow.
But once again, you have a very sincere figure. His wife and he both claim to be Bible-believing Christians. Supposedly, they actually even give a shout-out to Terry Cook, who is a fairly well-known Bible teacher and former police detective, I believe. But Terry Cook even recently appeared on Prophecy in the News. So he's
right.
the rounds, yeah. So, but they give him credit for helping to cast out demons that Ralphie was infected with as part of this mind control process. And so you kind of have interwoven into his stories reasons to believe or reasons to doubt that what he's telling you is in fact what really happened. That perhaps he was given false memories, elaborate false memories, that caused him to believe that he was transported to Mars, that he served on Mars, and that he had these experiences. And yet, Basiago gives very similar testimony, along with 2 other current-day people that are part of sort of another truther movement to proclaim the truth about Mars. And to top it all off, as if it wasn't strange enough, one of the travelers to Mars was a guy named Barry Soetoro.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah. Where's that name? How do we know that name? Oh, yeah, Barack Hussein Obama. And so, now just how serious is this taken? Well, Basiago has been taken serious enough that the White House even had to deny that what he was saying was true. I think one of the spokesmen for the president said, well, he hasn't traveled to Mars unless you count seeing Marvin the Martian on Warner Bros. Cartoons. So Obama denies that he was ever seen or known by Basiago, and that he ever traveled to Mars through a jump room, which I need to tell you about that facility here.
Yeah.
What is a jump room? Well, supposedly, Basiago is very detailed. He says that the jump room is an elevator-like structure in a building at 999 El Segundo Avenue near LAX, near the airport in Los Angeles. I've driven by there many times. There's an In-N-Out Burger right there. Because I've been through that In-N-Out Burger near LAX. And so supposedly that's the building where he was entered into the building, signed in, stepped into an elevator, and when he stepped off the elevator, he was in an underground base on Mars. Huh. And so, so there are other testimonies. William Cooper, who was well known as a conspiracy theorist, that tells us a lot about the JFK assassination, also talked a lot about the concept of underground military bases on Mars, claimed that we had a military base on Mars by the end of the 1960s. So, there's stories about the fact that the Nazis had already traveled to Mars through their flying saucers. So, anyway, the jump room is supposedly is a wormhole, something that we, according to the people I've talked to, one of them is a genuine rocket scientist who is a consultant to JPL, who wishes to remain nameless, but he basically told me that, that such ideas are just not within the realm of our current abilities. And of course, the people that believe them say, yeah, well, this is a different black ops group that, worked with Tesla and Tesla knowledge and Tesla information and came up with this actual ability to do that. So what is the truth? Well, it is certainly possible that these gentlemen did have these experiences. It is possible that they truly believed these experiences, and I suppose it's even possible that they could have actually happened the way they described them. But it's certainly also possible that they were being influenced heavily by demonic forces that were creating what Basiago himself even admits is possibly a bubble universe, a sort of small-scale universe fashioned by the gray aliens, which is what he says. It's possible that we didn't go to Mars. Perhaps we went to some kind of fictitious universe that was set up by the aliens, and it caused us to go there and think we were on Mars when in fact we weren't on Mars. So even that possibility is coming forward now.
Oh,
But
wow.
so there's anyway, there's a lot of material that is current day, that is still fresh, that is going on, so purporting that there are Martians. They are alive and well. They live under the surface. They live in these deep underground cities. Even David Wilcock, who has written a number of books, he's written a book most recently. I'm trying to think of anyway, there's several titles, but he's on record as talking about the Martian base. David Wilcox, Wilcox, talking about the Martian base, and that there's 500,000 people living in the Martian base, and they get transported to and fro through the jump rooms. There's a jump room supposedly in New Jersey and one in Los Angeles. And so you can find this material out on the internet. All you have to do is do a search for jump rooms. You can watch Vishago talk about at length his experiences. He'll go into great detail talking about his knowledge of Barack Obama when he was Barry Soetoro, and when he, when Obama supposedly came gallivanting across the horizon up to him and said, "Well, gee, here we are now on Mars." So, it's pretty spectacular in its claims, and I include it just because, as I say, sort of at the beginning of my book, I'm here to talk to you about the amazing stories of Mars and the lying wonders of Mars, and so much of this, in my opinion, is deception.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely have to agree.
Yeah.
You brought up the cosmic war before. Let's get into that.
Yeah, we
'Cause
have 10 minutes left. We can talk. This is another mythos. A fairly popular writer who is a very, very smart guy. He actually has a PhD from Oxford. He's a gentleman named Joseph P. Farrell, Farrell. And I don't know, he's written 20, 25 books. He's very prolific. But he is very much on the edge. He's definitely in the fringe, as you would say.
Mhm.
And he's created a mythos associated with the pyramids, that the Egyptian pyramids were in fact energy generators. They may have even been and were perhaps weapons of war. We talked earlier a bit about the concept of scalar physics, of this alternative physics, the hyperdimensional physics. Farrell believes that the Nazis were very close to figuring this out. There was a project known as the Die Glock, or the bell, the Nazi bell, and that it was something of a flying saucer, something of a time-traveling machine, and that the bell was sort of the breakthrough technology that one of the German scientists, whose name's escaping me, I have to think about that, he created the bell, and it was intended for the Germans to figure out how to alter time and space, and how to, in effect, create a weapon out of being able to suck energy out of what we talked about earlier, the ether, or the substance of creation. That one, in effect, could create a nuclear event by figuring out how to directly take energy out of time, if you will. It's a very different kind of crazy notion, so you sort of have to suspend what you know about and what you believe about Einsteinian physics to go with him on this mythos. But his is much more compelling, because his does rely upon scientists that do the speculation, and many scientists do go in this area, in this place, and they do agree that these ideas, these notions are possible. So it ties in, though, to an alternative explanation for the travel to Mars, the possibility that Mars was the moon, just as we talked about earlier, that Rahab was a planet, that it was destroyed. But the concept of what Farrell talks about is what he kind of comes under the heading of the cosmic war. He believes that there may have been, in fact, there probably was, on either the planet Earth or on another nearby planet somewhere in the galaxy, there was the knowledge of how to take hyperdimensional physics and how to transform a star, literally a star, and turn it into a weapon.
Wow.
It gets into, we hear in Star Trek and Star Wars and so forth, you hear about the idea of an ion cannon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so the notion has been around for some time that that in addition to the three states of matter that we learned in school, you may have learned of the fourth, the three states being a solid, a liquid, and a gas. The fourth state of matter is plasma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like the plasma displays on the television, except this plasma is really related to the plasma that is generated and exists in the nuclear reactor and exists within the star, within a star. It is another type of nuclear reaction that is not exactly fission, not exactly fusion, but it's another way to transform the power of the atom, the power into a potentially targetable weapon. And to give a simple explanation, I will attempt to here. I actually haven't tried to give this explanation before, so we'll see how well it works for you. But the idea is that here I'm going to get you back here where you're big on my screen. We're doing, although your listeners don't know this, we're doing this as a video call on Skype. So
yes,
so we're able to actually see one another's facial expressions. And I saw you roll your eyes when we said cosmic war. So
I did not roll my eyes. What a liar! You are the true deception, sir.
That's right. I'm being deceptive now. So,
I rolled my eyes at the Gap Theory, not the cosmic war. You get your facts straight.
That's correct. That's correct. Well, the idea of an ion cannon is that one is able to somehow separate the electrons from the positrons, the neutrons, and to create it and compress it in such a way through a cannon. Think of a sort of a cylindrical shaped object in which the electrons all escape out one direction, but the positrons escape out the other. And these positrons really are protons and neutrons, but that's where all the mass is in matter. The electron is in effect a massless charged object that it really has no mass at all. Mm-hmm. So you could be in effect hit by electrons and not necessarily notice it. But if you're hit by the combination of the protons and the neutrons, you're going to be blown apart because that's where all the power is. That's where the mass is. That's where the energy can come from. And so the concept of an ion cannon is to be able to compress matter in such a way that you can shoot out these ions, which are the particles that are missing their electrons, and you can attack an object. And the other part of the explanation has to do with resonances and being able to tag or address the ion cannon. You have to be able to detect a signature, a sort of a nuclear signature resonance of an object. And if you do, then it gets back to this notion we talked about earlier about gravitic waves. It's like your partner, which you've targeted, would be essentially identified, and these ions would be bombarding this partner that you've addressed, and so it would in effect blow the partner up. So one can literally blow up a planet with an ion cannon, or as I jokingly say, in kind of a pun, if you're shooting for the stars, one could actually shoot a star and blow the star apart. But it is the idea that you also would take possibly the power of a sun or a star and compress it down and use it as a force to target another object. So Farrell goes through. I probably butchered the science of that just horribly, but
it made sense to me. So you probably did.
Well, it's sort of use it as an analog. It's the best I can do. But Farrell talks about the science in detail, probably deeper than most people can go and can follow him. But anyway, what he suggests as it relates to Mars is that Mars shows evidence of this exploding planet. We talked a bit about that earlier. But it also shows evidence that Mars itself may have been attacked by some type of an ion cannon. And he's thinking specifically of the Valles Marineris, which is this gigantic valley that is 4 times deeper than the Grand Canyon, and it is as long as the United States is wide. Like I show a picture of this in the book,
Yeah.
to give you a sense of it. The Grand Canyon is about 30 miles long. This is something that's about 3,000 miles long, and it suggests that something massive had to hit the planet Mars to create this kind of canyon or this kind of valley. And so he's suggesting that it might have been, in fact, one of these ion cannons. He, in his other books, which I have not read yet, the Giza trilogy, he talks about how the pyramids, in fact, might have been these ion cannons. Well, that's an interesting idea. But can't go there. Haven't read them. So, but that's his theory. So the notion is that Mars may be an example of a victim of a planetary cosmic war between perhaps an ancient civilization on Earth. Here we kind of get back to the ancient alien theory and Farrell's idea of ancient aliens. May have been a civilization on the Earth. It may have been a civilization somewhere else in the solar system or in the galaxy, and that whoever aimed it at Rahab destroyed the planet. And as a scientific source, Farrell talks about Tom Van Flandern, the late Tom Van Flandern we mentioned earlier, who talked in detail about this and proposed that this, in fact, might have happened and might be the explanation for how the planet exploded. Because he doesn't suggest, Farrell suggests that there's really no known natural process. Although it does, another scientist who actually works at Alamogordo, a guy named John Brandenburg, who's written a book called Life and Death on Mars, he talks about the nuclear fallout that appears to be on the planet Mars, and he proposes that it might in fact have been from this kind of cosmic war. And then another scientist, Anthony Perot, he is a plasma technologist that works at Alamogordo out in New Mexico, and he has written a paper suggesting that there was a destructive event in our solar system that the inhabitants of the Earth saw. They were able to witness in the sky, because it would have created a massive amount of, in effect, aurora borealis type activity, magnetic activity. Mm-hmm. And where we see this is actually in ancient hieroglyphs, the Rongo hieroglyphs of Easter Island. We see this in other cave paintings all around the world, and these are dated to about 13,000 to 15,000 years ago.
Wow! And
so you pull this together, and the archaeologist, anthropologist named Robert Schock, who is a professor at Boston University, he talks about this on his website. I quote it in the book. But Schock says that the images that Perot talks about in his paper, in fact, match certain images in the Rongo script, and so there's this sort of growing view that humankind, and then we would add to it, a gap theorist like myself would add to it, well, perhaps a pre-Adamic race actually witnessed the explosion of Rahab, mm-hmm. and recorded it in cave paintings approximately 13,000 years ago.
Wow.
During this eon, when the Ouroboros was where it was, flat on the horizon, and that this is when this occurred. Mm-hmm. And perhaps they recorded this, and then within a certain period of time, the Earth itself was destroyed by the fallout, by the water that was on Rahab, and that enveloped the Earth. Perhaps the Earth passed through this water in outer space, was completely flooded and destroyed, and all life on the planet was destroyed. And that once this occurred, that it was a number of thousands of years later before God recreated the Earth and made it habitable again, separated the waters from the waters, and created Adam and Eve. Sort of a prototype. They were prototyped more or less by an earlier version of Homo sapiens. And in fact, it was done perhaps as a way, and this is where I just speculate, perhaps it was done as a way of showing Lucifer that Lucifer could not destroy God's creation. But as a reminder, God would take this sort of ape-like creature that was not that smart before, and would transform its intelligence and would create a capacity within it to communicate directly with God, and that God would know him directly, Adam, and Adam would also be a son of God, and that Adam would inherit the earth that Lucifer had tried to commandeer in a pre-Adamic period of time. And of course, there's a lot of stories that talk about this in the Zohar and other Sumerian folk tales, more or less, that the angels were told by God that he would glorify the human race above that of the angels, that in its eventual sort of final state, humankind would be transformed into glorified beings that would exceed the angels in their glory. And of course, that's what Paul tells us in Romans 8. So anyway, what we have here then is a kind of a weaving together of myths that scientists now are beginning to say things could have in fact happened in our solar system. The planet Mars is a testimony to this occurring. This is more or less what David Flynn was arguing for in his book Cydonia, The Secret Chronicles of Mars, although we've added some things that David didn't know about, such as the problem of Perot, as Farrell talks about, the cosmic war. In fact, Farrell may be talking about a cosmic war. He even postulates that there could have been a being like Satan, and he actually goes through the mythologies of Sumeria, of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and talks about the Tablet of Destinies, which is mentioned vaguely in the Bible. Farrell is not a biblical evangelical Christian, and yet he proposes that there may be a reconciliation between what the Bible says and what science may be discovering. And so you have a real peculiar way of bringing together, in effect, a way to reconcile the biblical account with science and with the planet Mars. And so there, now we have come full circle to say that's why I wrote the book, Lying One the Red Planet, is to say, yes, there's a lot of deception, but yes, Mars itself may actually hold a key to understanding what happened in the ancient times. No, it's not extraterrestrials. It's about a war between the angels and Yahweh. Mm-hmm. And that's the story that Mars may be telling us.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. It's awesome. I wish you had more time, Doug.
Well, we haven't covered everything. We may have to do another time together again in the future and talk more. You've got to work some more in your book too.
Yeah, very true. I mean, we could easily do a part 3 with the amount of information we haven't covered yet. I mean, your book is what's amazing about it is that it's so extensive and there's so much information, but it's not convoluted or complicated. You know, it's
readable. It's readable.
Yeah. It's a nice, simple, easy read, and I absolutely love that. And
that's not easy to do, by the way.
No, it's
that's the challenge. That's the challenge.
Yeah. Yep. Because oh yeah, definitely. That's kind of my writing style too. I try to make, big ideas as simple to understand as possible. But yeah, I would definitely suggest to the listeners, we have not at all by far we haven't covered everything. So don't think that if you listen to these 2 interviews you know the book, because there's so much in there that we haven't discussed. And again, I mean, we've just kind of scratched the surface of it. So to wrap this all up, because I know you're limited on time, and I have to share you with Doug Hemp today.
That's right. That's right.
Yep. So if you had to narrow it down, what would be the one thing that you would want our listeners to take away from this show, from both parts of the interview?
I think it's pretty simple. It's that there is a great deception coming. It's been underway for some time. Our minds have been prepared for this great deception. The deception is that E.T. and not Jehovah is responsible for the advancement of the human race, just as Prometheus, the god Prometheus, was supposedly the god who gave civilization to humankind. Today, we are being told that the modern-day Prometheus, E.T., is creating or has created a human species, and that there are records in our past, the ancient alien records, if you will, that suggest that it were these beings that made us what we are today. And the great deception, many of us believe, will be that the Antichrist will appear. Part of his full disclosure will also include the disclosure of the alien past and the connection with E.T., and that perhaps that even the mark of the beast will be a DNA upgrade that he may demand that we all take, so that we avoid death, or we avoid a plague, or participating in the plague that may be thereabouts on the human surface, and that this mark of the beast will in fact be the way that he in effect tries to infect us all with his blood, with his composition, and he may promise that he's transforming us into gods. But as that's part of the way I conclude the book, is the transformation of humanity into gods. That was the promise of Prometheus. It was the promise of Satan, of Lucifer, and it will be the promise of the Antichrist. And so the story of Mars may be, in fact, a way for us to understand the reconciliation of the Bible, the biblical account, with what is soon to come to pass. And as I have said from the outset, I believe Mars is likely to play a role in the Great Deception, the possible discovery of sort of unequivocal artifacts on the planet Mars, and that may be even more than the UFO, may be a testimony to why it's all true. But
Yeah,
just going to make the one final comment. Matthew 24:24, Mark 13:22. There will be signs and lying wonders in the heavens, Jesus said, that will be so compelling, I'm paraphrasing, that would be so compelling that if it were possible, even the elect would be deceived. And then he went on to say, let me make it very clear, I have told you about this beforehand, basically so that you will not be deceived. And so that's why I wrote the book, to tell people about this so that it may help them avoid being deceived if, in fact, they are here during this great disclosure. Now, those of us that believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, we may not be here. But nevertheless, that's why I've written the book.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fantastic. It's a great way to really wrap it up, and it's awesome. It's something that I definitely agree with, and that's really what the show's all about too, is trying to prepare people spiritually, but also just intellectually of the deceptions that are at hand now and what could be coming up in our future. Well, Doug, I don't even know what to say. What what an absolute pleasure this has been. And, again, we haven't even really scratched the surface of the depth of information you provide in your book. I know we mentioned it in the first part, but just to go over it again, if people want to find out more about you or order your book, where can they go?
They certainly can go to Amazon. They can go to Amazon.com. They can do a search on Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. It'll pop right up because people are buying the book now. Another possibility, people are interested, will take a little longer to get the book, but you get a lot of value. Prophecy in the News is now selling the book along with in a package that they call the Ancient Alien Package. You can go on to their bookstore and order it. And in the bookstore, you'll get the book. You'll get a DVD lecture I did, about a 100-minute lecture, video lecture on DVD, called The Transformation of Humanity into Gods, which talks a bit about Mars, talks a bit more about Prometheus and the DNA deception of the Antichrist and so on. They might enjoy that. There's also a lecture I did this last summer at Pikes Peak that is called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet. I cover a lot of the material with a lot of photographs and so forth. And there's also right now an offer to include Mark Biltz's talk on the blood moons over Israel. And the conference that Prophecy in the News will be doing in Orlando at the end of March will really emphasize a lot the blood moons, because the blood moons are going to happen about 2 weeks after we have the conference in Orlando. That's the first set of blood moons over Israel in the month of April at the time of Passover. and so forth. So anyway, so prophecyinthenews.com, ask for the Ancient Alien package. Look for that in their bookstore. You can also call them. So those are the two ways today that they can find my books.
Fantastic. And yeah, I'll say about the DVDs that are included in that Ancient Aliens package with your
Yes.
book. I've personally seen them, and they're very well done. I've myself have gotten a lot out of them. So
I
if
appreciate
people
that.
are in yeah, if people are interested in that, they should check that out, prophecyinthenews.com. Well, Doug, again, thank you so much for being on the show and enlightening us on this very important topic.
No, I appreciate it very, very much, and it's been a privilege and a lot of fun. And we will get together again. Perhaps we'll get together with Doug Hamp and have that discussion.
I would love to do that. Yeah, I would absolutely love to do that. All right. Well, again, that was S. Douglas Woodward, and his new book is called Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Exposing the Lie of Ancient Aliens. I have to say I have now read it in full, and I will be reading it again. The amount of
Appreciate
the
that.
yeah, well, I appreciate you writing it. It's definitely one of those books that you read it over a couple times, you're always going to get something new out of it. The amount of information that is both vital and exciting contained in this book is astounding, but so is the way it's conveyed, as I mentioned before. It's very relatable. It's an easy book to read. It's not one of those books that you have to have a master's degree to understand.
That's
There are
good.
even
Yeah.
there's even a few moments of humor found throughout, which is refreshing too. I'd highly suggest checking it out. So, that being said, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you for listening, and as always, take care and God bless.